Welcome back to 40 Studies That Change Psychology. It's time is part 2. Just a quick reminder before we get into this, make sure to go down and subscribe. That way you can get all the content that you need much easier. Reading 6. This study is the foundation of dreaming and REM sleep. As you can see, the first study literally says discovered REM sleep. This research was split into two parts. The first study was just researchers looking at people who are sleeping and recognizing the increased eye movement and measuring that. And that created the opportunity for the second study, which discovered REM rebound. And REM rebound taught us that we inherently need to dream. It's not something that we just do for fun, but our bodies actually need it. The researchers studied two different groups of people, and for one of them, they let them sleep normally, and for the other group, they didn't ever let them reach REM. Every time they were on the verge of reaching that REM part of sleep, they would wake them up and then put them back to sleep after. And what this did was that it created a prolonged period where that group couldn't actually dream. And after some time of that, when they conducted studies, it was very clear that those people had higher levels of stress, anxiety, a lack of concentration. Tons of different negative psychological effects were discovered when people weren't allowed to dream. That pushed these researchers to the conclusion that humans inherently need to dream. Reading 7. This one goes into the neurology of dreams, and it goes against the Freudian belief that dreams are some sort of an internal conscious that's trying to bring itself out, and we're too afraid to actually consciously admit that we believe or want those things. Instead, it explains that dreams are caused by internal impulses in our brain, ones that are different from the ones that we're awake. When we're awake, those impulses come from outside, all the information that we're getting. But when we're asleep and we're not getting any of those impulses, it ends up being internal impulses that the brain itself gives off. Furthermore, it also talks about how our bodies are paralyzed, and that protects us from accidentally hurting ourselves when we're asleep. And then finally, it also touches on the fact that there can be some possible meanings in dreams, but not in the Freudian sense, more in the idea of the mental state of the dreamer. If somebody's consistently getting certain types of dreams, then it could be an indication of a certain condition or a certain situation that they're going through in their life. It's a lot more straightforward if there is any meaning, and it's probably not some sort of deep unconscious thing like Freud was trying to argue. Reading 8. This one goes more into detail about different states of consciousness aside from just being awake and asleep. And this one attacks the idea that hypnosis is an actual different state of consciousness. Instead, the researchers hypothesized and eventually came to the conclusion that hypnosis is not a different state of consciousness, but just a feeling and a position that the hypnotized person voluntarily puts themselves into. And as you can see, there's two reasons for hypnosis that the researchers give. The first reason for this that they give is that actions are believed to be involuntary. People who are hypnotizing others often give statements and suggestions and put the hypnotized person in a situation where they are pushed to believe that what's happening to them is involuntary, when in reality it's just normal behavior. For example, a lot of times they'll tell them to put their arms out and then start suggesting to them that their arms are starting to feel heavy, and the person who's being hypnotized believes that it's involuntary, but in reality it's because of gravity. If your arm is out for some time, it's gonna start to feel heavy. The second reason is that the process of hypnotization and the belief you're gonna get hypnotized creates expectations, and humans oftentimes, when they have expectations, end up preparing themselves and starting to believe their expectations will come true. And this is something that was tested throughout the study, and it came back conclusive that that is exactly the case. For example, they studied that people who are able to get more involved in the situation and really believe that they're in a fictional situation, then they're more likely to get quote-unquote hypnotized, because they are creating that expectation and are readying themselves for that to happen. Whereas someone who doesn't really get that involved in the process of hypnotization usually doesn't get very successfully hypnotized because they never created that expectation in the first place. Reading 9, this should be pretty obvious what it's about just by the title, and this study is about the famous Pavlov dogs. The main thing to remember is that it introduced the idea of unconditioned versus conditioned reflexes. Dogs have certain unconditioned reflexes. They're just innately born with it. For example, when a dog or a human sees food and then starts salivating, that's an unconditioned response that we have to food. We see it and our body already knows what to do. But then there's also conditioned reflexes, like what Pavlov did in his study, where he used a metronome and timed that exactly when the dogs got food, so that over time the dogs were conditioned to that whenever they saw or heard the metronome, they then remembered the food was probably going to come soon after that because it always had been, and that way they started salivating. Conditioned reflexes were able to take a stimuli that was unrelated to the original response, which was the metronome and the salivating, and then connect them together by a process of conditioning. And this study is really, really important because it was one of the foundations for behavioral psychology. Reading 10 is an extension of Pavlov's study, and it shows how important reflexes and conditioning can be. These researchers wanted to see if Pavlov's idea of conditioned versus unconditioned spread through other more complex human behaviors like emotions. So here they took a slightly questionable approach when they took a little infant and then over time saw if they could condition a fear of rats into that kid. Their process was pretty similar to what Pavlov was doing with the dogs, except what they did is that they took furry animals, rats, and then paired them with things that would scare the kid, like loud sounds. The process of giving the rat with the loud sound over and over again eventually did condition the child to be afraid of that rat. Reading 10 shows how crucial reading 9 was for the creation and the foundation of behavioral psychology. So that's going to be it for part 2, reading 6 through 10. Make sure if you haven't already to go and subscribe so that you can get all the content whenever you need it, and to turn on the bell so that you can get notifications right when things are uploaded and you don't have to go searching around for them yourself. Also, make sure to like if you liked and do all that other fun stuff. And until next time.